This week we're going to be designing a book cover based on the life of legendary designer David Carson. He's a really interesting designer for many reasons. So I want to talk about him a little, and then there is a TED conference that I would encourage you to watch. It's the next posting on the list, and where he actually talks and you get to hear about him and his process. He's a funny guy, so it's really interesting. So David Carson lived in San Diego, and this is kind of the mid-'80s, early '90s, and he was a sociology major in college. I think he went to San Diego State, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But he was just a sociology major. He got his degree. He started to teach high school. He was also a professional surfer, and he had no formal design or art training. So he's living in San Diego, and he got a job with a magazine called Beach Culture as a copywriter. And he loved to experiment. And so in this job, he began to do some really innovative things with text. And because he had no design or art training, he never followed a grid. He didn't really think about the grid as important. His idea was that the content of the article was being interpreted with the visuals, and what the article said really didn't matter. It was more about the overall message of the article. And this magazine was, very innovative, and designers and graphic artists were its primary readership. So here's a couple of images. You can see that because he had no formal design training, he wasn't really an illustrator. His primary tools were text and photography. So he would do really interesting things with text. He would crop it. He had kind of a total disregard for information hierarchies and grid format. And so he explored really the expressive possibilities of each subject. After successfully working for Beach Culture, he got a job as art director for a magazine called Raygun. And Raygun grew to have over 150,000 readers. It really was an attractive magazine for artists, innovative artists and designers. And it was breaking a lot of rules with typography, with image making, and Carson was primarily responsible for that. So in breaking design conventions, often Carson would disregard letter spacing. He would overlap letters. Sometimes it became almost completely illegible. You couldn't read it, or he had no problem covering up part of the text in his design. And anything could happen in his design, and he embraced accidents. This was a really famous article, which he talks about in the video you're going to watch, the TED conference. It was an article on Brian Ferry, and he transcribed the whole article in dingbat, making it completely illegible. And this just infuriated some writers and some designers, and so he kind of justifies himself in the TED conference. So when you watch it, you'll see what he has to say about this article. But this had never been done. Taking this approach to typographic design was completely experimental. Often he would display credits instead of headlines, and work with hand-drawn text, distort text. You'll see a lot of the imagery that he works with became blurry and abstracted. Sometimes he would turn columns into kind of curved, irregular shapes. This is another famous design. This is actually Lyle Lovett, and he focused on, instead of focusing on Lyle Lovett, who's actually really interesting looking, he's a character, he chose to focus on his feet because he's pigeon-toed. So he just put this image in the magazine without showing Lyle Lovett's face, which was, pretty interesting. People commented about this quite a bit. Another thing he did, in one article, he had this strip of white tape, and the tape was meant to crop the photograph, but he thought it looked cool, so he just kept it in, and he didn't edit it out in his design. So he really embraced these things that happened and turned them into part of the process. And often these accidents were, really creative, innovative things that happened to his work because he was so experimental. So here's another example of these interesting curved irregular shapes, these text boxes. He would angle them, he'd curve them, he'd overlay them onto imagery. Sometimes, as you can see in this example, he would really kind of oversaturate or desaturate the images. One thing you have to remember, though, is he's incredibly intuitive with design. So I would not call him random. He really thinks about what he does. He has an incredible ability to visualize. And his designs, the reason I think he's so successful as a designer and was able to do this, because he had such an intuitive ability to create interesting graphical relationships. So this is not easy. It's not easy to just take a bunch of stuff and throw it onto a page and make it look good. It's actually incredibly difficult. And he took this chaos and he turned it into message. So all of his design efforts are really trying to communicate something. It's not just random experimentation. So it's really important to remember that about him, that even though sometimes it looks like he's just throwing things onto the page, and he is to some extent experimenting, he's also thinking about the content of the work, the articles, the message, and that, I think, is what is key about his work. So another thing that became apparent was he got so criticized for really making some of the text illegible, and what designers discovered was that readers would decipher. If it was visually interesting and compelling, designers had previously assumed that if it was too complicated, readers would not be able to look at it and they wouldn't decipher it. But that actually wasn't the case. Because this work was interesting and engaging, readers took that effort and they deciphered what was going on and were able to read this imagery, even though it was extremely complicated. After Raygun, he did begin to work for some big corporate clients. Pepsi was one of his clients, and Nike. So you can kind of see this is a Pepsi ad he did for them. I think I have another example of this later on. Here's another one. He's still kind of true to form, really working experimentally, thinking about the image and how he can really break the boundary. And he really continued and has continued throughout his career to take legibility to the edge, to take this work to the very far edge and see what happens. I love this one. Someday you will die somehow and something's going to steal your carbon. So you can see he's an environmentalist and kind of poking fun a little bit in this design. Another example of Raygun. The other thing he did was once he was working with Raygun, he really encouraged openness, and he created this kind of open forum for illustrators, photographers. He often would show new emerging designers, artists, photographers, illustrators. He encouraged them to create zines, which are these self-published magazines that were really started in the late 1980s, early 1990s because of the technology innovations with computer printing. Suddenly people could print at home. Everything was word processing was much more streamlined and easy. So he was part of this kind of open forum, encouraging this communication and thinking about how we can kind of change the formal structure and make design more open and more really for everyone, the masses. Here's another example of some of his Nike work and his Pepsi work. You can see that he still, keeps it edgy, even though he's working with corporate clients. Couple more here. He often brings these beautiful, amazing landscape surfing imagery into his work. Like over here, you can see it. This is a snowboarder, actually. And it was often part of ray gun, this kind of environmental photography, really beautiful. Another one, you can see how text turned on its side here and barely visible. Sometimes he would fade the text so much that you'd almost have to search for it on the page. He always, though, really connected what was happening between pages, so he kept that kind of visual style consistent. So it's not haphazard. He really keeps this kind of visual connection going throughout the whole page. So a famous quote by him, he'll say it in the TED conference, don't mistake legibility for communication. So that is one of the questions we have, I think, it's either on our quiz or our Helvetica discussion, but I want you to think about that. What does it mean? Don't mistake legibility for communication.